A very basic question. What is the relationship between the Archbishop Sacco and the Patriarch in Constantinople?
There's no ecclesial relationship whatsoever.
Completely separate.
They're entirely different things. So the Chaldeans are an Eastern Catholic church, a self-governing Eastern Catholic church, which is in union with the Holy See. They adhere to Catholic theological and Christological beliefs, but they're not Latin in their religious approach or liturgically.
Talk. I have two questions. One in a historical perspective. Say, for example, in India, Hindu-Muslim, they live very cordially together. And there is a Christian population as well, so similar to the Iraq, Muslim, non-Muslim. So there has been Gujarat riot, the communal riot. So is there any similarity? In historical perspective, has there been any riot between Shia, Sunni, or say, for example, in India, sometimes still we hear the churches are attacked. So in a historical perspective, the communal situation, if you can share on that. And the second question is, since 2003, sometimes in the media I have seen, there is the perception of the local Muslims, Iraqi Muslims, that the external forces have occupied Iraq, and there is some religious connotations behind that, that the external religious groups are trying to proselytize, convert the Muslims to Christianity. So there is a tension there, if that's the news is right. So what the government has done to address this issue. So one in historical perspective and a contemporary one, if you can answer.
I think historical communal relations have always been challenging for the Christian communities in Iraq. But if we think in the wider context of the Middle East, the majority Muslim population only probably emerged maybe in the 11th or 12th century. So for a very long time, Christians remained a very large and great proportion of Middle Eastern life, and that was very well reflected in Mesopotamia as it was then. Certainly, as we know, as the Muslim population grows larger within many contexts, non-Muslim communities are very challenged often to sustain and reside in those contexts. There's and particularly within the context of the Middle East, often perceived as sort of the heartland of Islam, sort of a more rigorous implementation of Muslim identity would be practiced there, which perhaps, say, in Malaysia or Indonesia may not be so rigorous in certain instances. In terms of the second part of your question, in terms of since 2003, were you referring to the that there being missionary presence by Christians in Iraq, or sorry?
External missionary presence.
And there was a very small contingent of Western Protestant missionaries who entered Iraq alongside coalition forces in 2003. They either rapidly left or were effectively faced severe threats, and a number of them were killed.
I have questions. Two questions. Did you say there was a third of the population of Baghdad was Jewish prior to World War I?
That's as I understand it, yes.
Wow, that's really interesting. Second question is, Chaldean community in Iraq. Would there be any kind of lifestyle or cultural differences, that would be distinct, apart from just like class and rural, urban cultural differences that the Christian would have from a Muslim Iraqi?
Until about the 1960s and 1970s, the Chaldeans would have been socioeconomically higher status in general terms in urban areas. Mm-hmm. In rural areas, there would have been no real distinction at all. So if you wanted to go to a good doctor in 1940s Iraq, you may well have gone more likely to a Jewish or Christian mm-hmm. doctor. That changed as the oil revenues developed in Iraq and public education improved. But for example, the first nursing college in Baghdad was opened by Dominican nuns, I think in the 1950s. So perhaps if someone who hasn't answered the question.
Yeah. Thank you for your talk. Very interesting. So two things. First, has there been any? So there've been lots of proposals that floated around about how you can federalize Iraq and different things like that. And one of those I've heard has been calls for a federalized state in the Assyrian Triangle for the Christian communities. Have these calls ever been taken very seriously by Christian communities or even by government officials now that there seems to be some sort of recognition of trying to fix the relationship since 2014? And maybe has that been affected by the revival of the military awareness by Christian communities?
I think historically, Christians have always largely viewed themselves as being integrated to Iraqi society, both geographically and in terms of socio-economic. Maybe that's changing, and because of the level of violence they faced, the popularization of an idea of a separate so-called Assyrian state is coming forward. Now, to my mind, I think that's a very dangerous idea because you exclude yourself from the rest of Iraqi life in which you have been a part for 2,000 years or so.
Last question. I was particularly interested in the description of the closeness of Christians to Shia in the south, which is of course also the heartland for the Hashd-e-Shaabi. So, one of the strongest forces fighting in the north. And so, just curious if you have any thoughts on how that closeness plays out in terms of post-Mosul, northern Iraq, and who the Christians look to for protection, who they look to for asserting, for trying to hang on to maybe their lands that are kind of disputed areas between the Kurds and whatever authority comes next to assert control over those areas. Just curious if you had any thoughts about how that relationship in the south plays out in the north.
Certainly since 1991, the Kurds have been very open to having if the Christians want to move there, that's great. They view them as a non-political threat. They're not a religious threat. They just want them there because they know they're going to be a peaceful community. Since 2014, the Kurds have helped to form, as I understand it, Christian militia groups, if the Christians haven't raised them themselves. I'm sure the Shia community leaders are keeping a very close eye on what the Christians are doing, and they're happy to encourage and support the Christians up to a point, and to permit them to return to their own villages and towns, or what were predominantly Christian villages and towns. But I think there would be a point at which the Shia would say, yeah, you can go so far, but we don't want to see a militant Christian presence perhaps any longer than it takes to defeat the Islamic State. That being said, we look perhaps more widely in the Middle East, and we look at the Christian communities in the State of Israel or in the Syrian Arab Republic. The greatest allies today of the Christians in the region are this rather peculiar mix of the Russian Federation, the Syrian Arab Army, Hezbollah, and Israel. It's very odd, but that's the reality.
I was wondering if you could elaborate more on some of the tension between the Sunni community and the Christians in Iraq. I was in Karakosh the day after the Christians were ejected from Mosul. And I kind of find it strange, the idea that of the Shia community being closer to the Christians than the Sunni community, particularly because one of the reasons why Christians were not massacred in Mosul is because the community was so close to them. It was something, when ISIS was butchering people, being the government, being Shia, for getting all kinds of things, they couldn't touch the Christian community at that time because they were too close to the people of Mosul. I've also seen firsthand the Shia militias target Christian communities in Baghdad. Yeah. It's not as publicized as the attack on Sayyid al-Najat church, but there's. But I think it's difficult to talk about the dynamic being between Christian versus the Muslim community, more as Christians being affected by political authorities. I lived in Ankara in Erbil. I don't know many Christians living in Erbil that would say the Kurds are their friends. The political authority.
I mean, I would say
I think just as big of a problem is the ethnic cleansing of property registration, which take place, and the lack of interest in rebuilding Karakosh and a lot of these communities devastated by ISIS. So I was wondering if you talk about kind of the complications of saying, the Sunnis are more or less close to the Christian community. I think it's a very local issue.
Yeah, that's true. It's quite a local issue to Iraq up to a point, but I think Broadly speaking, that has been the case over the last 50 years or so. And that's just my experience and what I've engaged with the Christian communities and what they've told me. Certainly I'm aware in the diaspora, the Iraqi Christian communities are often more close to Shia Muslim communities than necessarily to the Sunni Muslim communities as well. And again, as you pointed out, a very notable exception to the rule in Mosul. That, again, that's just my experience, such as it is, but I wouldn't disagree with anything fundamentally you said.
I'm from Baghdad. Yeah, and I have like, actually you can't determine previously whether this guy is Christian or Muslim or anything like that. You just can't tell by the looks or by the way they live or anything like that. The only thing probably you can make like know if this person is Christian or Muslim is by wearing a cross. That's it. I have two of my best friends actually Christians. One of them just got killed in one of the bombing in Baghdad along with my cousins, because he's like friend of family, also a friend of mine. And the other one is like he's sitting over there in Turkey waiting for the Iran. He's filing a case. So just commenting on how like people or let's say Shia popularity or they're really embracing Christian more than, let's say, not more than Sunnis. Actually, the extremist Sunnis, their thoughts are more like close to ISIS thoughts, or like just like Christian people just can't live among us without paying any, let's say, taxes. Or I don't know what's the term, the exact term. Forget my English. The thing is, like they have certain rules for Christian to be among us as a society. Actually, the Shia population doesn't have this political issues. Like even one of my relatives, actually he got married to a Christian woman. So you can find that. I think you can find it in a Sunni population. Where like as a Shia, as an person also that white in the south, more like in the north of Iraq, because the south of Iraq is really mostly Shia population, and Christian over they're like more like find the sanctuary over there. It's like everything easy to deal with. With Shia people, more like the Sunni. But in Mosul, they used to have very good relationships, very tight relationships, because all the major Chaldean church over there, it's really got really popular, and there's a lot of people over there. Even go to their schools, go to their all the government departments together as everything. But I think it's after ISIS, after this all extremists, after all these incidents, that it's really hard for Christian people to live out there with all having, the idea.
I don't think this has been addressed, but assuming the relations between Christians and Shia are stronger in general than Christians and Sunni, what are the various ways that one might account for that? Is it because, one could think theological reasons, one could think political reasons related to colonialism? Is there sort of an obvious answer to why that would be the case?
I don't think there's one obvious answer. I think it's partly how the Shia are used to being a minority within the broader Islamic context, so they're more comfortable with dealing with other quote-unquote minorities. They're more comfortable with dealing with difference in a lot of other cases because they're a minority. We think, trying to think what's a good comparison. Perhaps we might think of, the Islamic Republic of Iran. Perhaps we might think the most militant, ostensibly Shia country in the world, still has a very substantial Christian population, has the largest Jewish population in the Middle East outside of the State of Israel. The most ostensibly, Sunni state in the region, perhaps one of the Gulf states, would not be as comfortable in dealing with, a significant Christian or Jewish community in its own constituency.
This kind of maybe captures a number of the questions, but from your work in terms of taking steps forward for in Iraqi people to think of themselves as Iraqis rather than as Sunnis or Shia or Christians or Yazidis, are there steps that since 2014 where you've seen kind of hopeful signs for that? You mentioned the work of Patriarch Sacco, stuff that's happened in Kirkuk. That seems to be one of the primary concerns is with so many very relevant threats, you have communities seeking to kind of become more closed for protective reasons. Is there an idea of kind of this multicultural Iraqi identity that is that still present, and what are ways that groups, whether from a theological, political, cultural aspect, can help to support that identity?
I suppose one example might be the new Catholic University of Erbil, which opened in 2015. So that's the first Christian higher education institute opened since the 1960s in Iraq. So I suppose they wouldn't have done that unless there was some type of sense of hope. And indeed that's open to all, regardless of ethnic or religious background. I'm not aware of particular attempts by the government other than this sort of broad amelioration of their approach to the Christian communities.
Where is the university?
It's in Erbil, the capital of Iraqi Kurdistan.
Are there any contested ideologies within the Christian community? Sacco is very powerful, but basically there is this diaspora community that wants to establish the United States. And, does he cater to them when he's outside of Iraq? Is there,
I mean, I couldn't speak to Sarko's mind, but I would imagine he's very frustrated with attempts to try and establish this Nineveh Plain state. But again, I could be wrong. I think Christians have been so badly impacted by events since 2003 in Iraq that on a personal day-to-day level, they may talk about church politics and whose family is in charge of what and why they shouldn't be and all the rest of it. But they've had to come together and realise that it's so vital and so important to sustain their community that they've just gone over to cooperation instead of any antagonistic relationships.
Is there anyone supporting the idea of a Nineveh Plain state outside of Iraq?
Other than the diaspora
Yeah.
Christian communities who advance the sort of Assyrian ethnic identity, I'm not aware of any. I don't think the Kurds are. No, so I don't think so.
To see what you think about it. I really love Joseph Campbell. He writes about kind of imagining the current that comes through Iran, Zoroastrianism, and actually enters the Middle Eastern religions, and to some extent even the Babylonian captivity shows that. And the original religion of that area in Iran, Zoroastrianism, they kind of imagine a savior figure, and there's kind of a sense of a perfection of that figure. And I wonder, in Christianity, it comes out of the perfection of a savior figure. And I know that the imams, the 10 and the 12, I guess the 7 and 12, depending on the school, there's a sense of that they are perfected beings. I know that's a great source of dispute I've seen with students of both Sunni and Shia. They often dispute about that. So I'm wondering if that's maybe part of why the Shia and the Christians might kind of organically have some similar, deeper Iranian belief.
Yeah, that's probably very true, and I think it's perhaps also a sort of broader national and historical, ethnic, religious identity in both Iraq and Iran. What is it they say, that Iran is an irreligious population with a irreligious government? The Iraq is a religious population with an irreligious government, I think is the joke.
If we,
I was wondering, what's the attitude? You said the Christian population has been really negatively affected since 2003. But what's their attitude toward the U.S. government?
I think it's a very pragmatic one. If the U.S. government wants to help and sustain them, that's great. But they're also aware of the long-term impact of trying to get involved in Western involvements in the region, and they, if tomorrow they could go back to they could go back to what the status quo was on 19th of March 2003. I'm sure most Christians would want that. They would, if you speak to them privately, they would acknowledge the good things that the American government has done up to a point since trying to rectify the situation, or indeed Britain as well. But universally negative unless they want to come here and apply for a visa, I presume, which is quite understandable, really.
Well, thank you very much. I don't know if you're some of these slides the charts were very interesting. I don't know if you can make them available or anything, but there or where we could find them. But I'd certainly would like to use some of them for my classes.
I'm happy to share them.
Thanks very much for coming.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.